Welcome to the Next Pivot Point podcast. This season, I'm focused on sharing stories and ideas about diversity and inclusion. In this episode, I will share some insights and ideas of my own, Julie Kratz, and together we will leave you some actionable tips to think about and discuss with your organization. I share this information because inclusive leadership is a journey. It requires bravery and courage, and you do not have to do it alone. At Next Pivot Point, I believe we are stronger together. We are one. So this week's topic, I wanted to follow up on the bonus episode that we did about racism in America and really what you can do to show that you're an ally. I had a tremendous response to that podcast, so I thought maybe we need to do a part 2. So a week or so later, not much has changed, but a lot has happened, I would say. And as somebody that aspires to be and strives to be a white ally for people of color, and especially the African American community right now, I would say the big things I've noticed is people are getting really curious about racism. And this is fairly unprecedented. The R word has not been a term that's been thrown around in corporate America much. In fact, bookshelves have been filled with books on racism for years, but I would say largely untouched or certainly haven't hit bestsellers lists. They have now, which is really incredible to see that kind of response to things like antiracism, white fragility, me and white supremacy, some of the books I mentioned in my post and in my previous podcast episode to check out. The cool thing about that is that shows to me that people are curious and they want to learn more. And perhaps in the pandemic world where we have more time on our hands and more time to learn and to grow and digest content like podcasts, like Seeing White, for example, that I mentioned last time, as well as books, this is really a chance to be an ally. And gone are the days of I'm too busy to do that. No, you're not. And maybe you never really were too busy to do this hard work, but maybe the barriers were real, at least in our minds. So this is an interesting time where we have people that are getting educated about this tough topic, and that's exciting. So the best-selling list being populated with diversity and inclusion books is news to my ears. I would add another one, Lead Like an Ally. Our latest work talks about how to be an ally to people of color and to women and underrepresented groups in the workplace. So if you're looking for content on that, definitely check that out. In addition to what else has happened in the news this week, I think we've seen a global response to George Floyd's death. And that's interesting because, again, unprecedented waters that we're in now, where this movement has sustained for more than a week. Most of the Black Lives Matter activity and certainly the aftermath of deaths, many, unfortunately, so many on that list in the last few years, don't last more than a couple days. This one is sustaining the length of time and is getting global responses. Sports teams doing things with their jerseys, showing solidarity. Marches happening globally in New Zealand and in the UK. Prime ministers and global leaders coming out and talking about how wrong this is. Statements from corporate America about this. Some good, some not so good, by the way. This is something new. We haven't seen this level of a global, universal response before to racism. And this is also something that's exciting about positive change. So people are hungry to learn more. There is a global response. There is sustained activity for more than a week. So there's some really good indicators here that out of something so gruesome and so negative, we could really be in a more positive situation going forward. So I want our listeners to consider how you can be an ally to others. And the call to action and the subject I really want to dive into today, something that's near and dear to my heart, is being an ally, but not just any ally. Specifically, I've had a number of candid conversations over the last nearly 2 weeks since George Floyd's death with white men. And I would say this is a real call to action for white men to speak up and to not be silent about racism any longer. And I'll tell you quite frankly, there are some real barriers to white men engaging in this conversation. The barriers I've heard directly from them have been, I am not touching that conversation. There's too much to lose. When I follow up further and ask what is it they'll be losing, it's their egos, their pride, the 1% chance that I could say or do something wrong and be called out for it publicly and be shamed for it. Now, I know people of color and women and people with disabilities in the LGBTQ plus community, you are likely rolling your eyes right now. I understand. Now, for white men, I think I understand where you're coming from. I personally do not agree, but I do empathize with that position because there's a lot of reasons why in white men's mind that is justified. Years and decades of socialization on what it means to be white and what it means to be a man says to be confident, to be strong, to be heroic, to be in charge, to know the answers, to be stoic. The list goes on. You know what a man can resemble. So to tackle something like racism and say this is wrong, or I'm here to listen, or I don't have the answers, it's very counterintuitive to the white male narrative of how we're socialized here in the United States. And therein lies the conundrum that we're in. How do you undo the years of socialization to be one way and to be the white male archetype when in fact confronting racism requires vulnerability, it requires empathy, it requires emotional intelligence, it requires listening to learn and curiosity, none of which is synonymous with being a white man. So for white men, number one, I get it. I empathize with the position that you are in, and it's not fair. And also, here's the ask. The ask is to do something uncomfortable. The ask is to get comfortable being uncomfortable, to use your voice because it matters more. It's listened to more. It amplifies the voices of people of color in the African American community that really need you right now. And I would ask you to think about somebody you care about that's adversely affected by racism. A friend, a coworker, somebody you used to know, a childhood friend, anyone. And ask, are you okay with this happening to them? Because if you are, and you're okay with this behavior continuing, say nothing. But if you're not okay with another George Floyd happening to somebody you know and somebody you care about, then your choice is to say something. Your only choice is to speak up and advocate for what is right. Now, what do I mean by advocating? What do I mean by speaking up? I'm not saying you have to go actively protest. You don't even have to post something on social media. If you feel comfortable doing those things, go for it. But being an ally is much like choosing your own adventure. You can start with simply picking up a book, listening to a podcast, some of the things we talked about in last episode. If you want to go deeper, you can have a candid conversation with somebody that is in the African American community and not put the ownership on them to explain to you what's going on or how they feel, but simply saying, I want to listen and learn from you. Would you have 15 minutes to share your perspective on what's going on right now? No pressure. That goes a long way to just showing that you care. And what can happen in as short as 15 minutes is you learn a ton of information you didn't know before. But you have to truly listen. It's not time for you to share your perspective. It's not time for you to weigh in on your opinion about the protesting or the politics or how things are being handled. It's your time to listen. So that's one. A listen and learn session, 15 minutes is all that will cost you. The second thing I would offer is to dig deep a little bit. And this is more of an reflective exercise. Think about your own privilege. And I know the P word is another loaded word, just like the R word with racism. But I'd ask you to think about the lens of the world of which you grew up in. Think about the storybooks you read as a child. Think about the people that taught you in school, the people on your leadership team at your company. Do they look like you? Do they behave like you? Are you welcomed in settings with them openly? If you were to compare notes with a person of color, a woman, someone in the LGBTQ plus community, someone with a disability, etc., you would often find that they would not answer the same way to those questions. So if you answer positively to people like you growing up as a child and reflected in the workplace and leadership today, then you have privilege. And in privilege is a chance to help others. Privilege is actually a really positive thing when we choose to look at the other side of what we can do with privilege and how to honor it. It's a chance to be an ally. The more privilege you have, the more likely your voice is to be heard. The more that people will respect what you have to say about racism because they believe you don't have skin in the game somehow, that you don't stand to directly benefit from this conversation. So think about your privilege. Have a listen and learn session. The third and final idea I'll leave with our listeners, especially white men that want to be allies, is really think about your own biases at play. If this is painful for you or causing some knee-jerk reactions, or you're not sure how to handle it, or you really don't like how police are being treated right now, or you think this doesn't happen as often as people think, unpack your own biases that might be leading to that belief system. Oftentimes our beliefs manifest themselves in our thoughts and our actions. So we have to really get to our beliefs and our biases to understand how it's impacting our behavior. The beautiful thing with this is you can do something reflective. It requires no interaction with another human. Simply take the Harvard Implicit Bias Test. It's called implicit.harvard.edu. We'll link to it in the show notes. It takes no more than 10 minutes to complete an assessment. They have one on race, they have one on gender, age, 12 different categories, in fact. So you choose your own adventure and decide how you want to assess your own bias. But think about your bias. Be aware of your bias. 95% of people have racial bias. So if you do, you are not alone. 100% of people have some bias at least some of the time. So knowing your bias, then you can understand how it might be impacting your behavior, and you can intervene with your bias before it shows up in something you might say or do. That might be one of those reaction moments where you fear it might be poorly received. Those are my thoughts, allies. I am so thankful for you listening to this message. Share the word. If you liked what you heard today, share with potential allies in your network, especially white men. We really need them involved in the conversation to propel positive change. They are the decision makers, the wealth holders, the power holders in our country and globally. Until we get white men involved in the conversation, we're not going to go very far, and social change will not happen swiftly like it needs to. So share this with a potential ally and say, you are an ally. You need to listen to this. Thank you for being my ally. Did you know that you can find all 5 seasons of our 50 plus episodes at nextpivotpoint.com? There, you can also check out our new program, Lead Like an Ally, and order our new book, Lead Like an Ally. I appreciate you listening to this episode. Who do you know that needs to hear this message? Hit the share button, connect with me on LinkedIn, Julie Kratz, Kratz. I host this podcast because I believe we are stronger together. We are one.